come to Science 7, and I'm holding up here a photograph of an art object that was found in the middle of the Gobi Desert about 100 years ago by Sir R.L. Stein. He was under commission from the British Museum, and he was one of the first explorers to ever go into the Gobi Desert and found the remains of several cities that 1,000 years ago had been the most sophisticated cities in the world. But because the Gobi Desert, in its relentless desiccation, the caravan routes and possibilities going across many parts of the Gobi Desert were eradicated, and the cities were abandoned, and they were covered by sand. This particular graphic is a scroll of the originators of Chinese civilization, Fuxi and his consort, Nu Gua. And the two of them are the founders of Chinese civilization. Fuxi is the originator of the trigrams that became the hexagrams of the I Ching, and Nu Gua is the dragon lady originally, who was his consort in a universal way. And you can see that their serpentine dragon bodies are intertwined together, and they are an image 1,000 years ago of the double helix of DNA. They hold in their upraised hands the two items that are necessary. Let him come in. Come in. They hold between them the two items that are necessary to build an architecture. He holds what is called a carpenter's square, so that you can true a right angle and true a square. And if you rotate the carpenter's square, you can use the point of the angle as a compass to make a circularity. She holds in her upraised hand a plumb bob. A plumb bob to find the center, to find the perpendicular. And these two together with their double helix spiral are also the ancient Hermetic caduceus, the caduceus of Hermes, the caduceus of Mercury, who holds a staff which has entwined double serpents, and their heads face each other, and at the top of the staff, in between the heads, is a sphere, and it is the sun, it is the moon, but it is also a Pythagorean wisdom sphere of being able to translate lines of action into forms that take place in three-dimensional space. And this is exactly what life does with DNA. It has sequences which are specific and exact, that have been determined over billions of years of life on this planet, and perhaps 10 billion years of life in the universe at large. And the way that it works is that specific lines of information that have a beginning, they have their middle, and they have their end, encode exactly a structure, but the structure must be taken out of a linear encodement and put into a three-dimensional space so that they can be existential. This happens initially by a folding. And so the linear code prescribes structures that then take that coding and make a folding, but the folding is not like origami. It's not like just simple folding of something, folding a sheet of paper in half and then folding that in half. The folding takes place in a dynamic spiraling context because the code itself is not in some linear rod, but the code itself is part of the arcing of a spiral and so carries this rotational energy with it. And that rotational energy is more properly called a dynamic. And so reality is made out of something which has a dynamic verve and an energetic structure that holds in stability together. And so when one looks at what are the structures that are made by the DNA sequences, one understands that they come to be a series of 20 amino acids that in various combinations will then make the basis of proteins with enzymes as the triggering helpers in this process. What is further notable and was discovered very quickly in the 1960s is that the DNA code works by a very simple three-part codon. And of those three-part codons, there are only 64. So that the ancient trigrams of the I Ching, being 3, and being a set of 3 in pairs, so that what one gets there is 3 pairs, 2 times 2 is 4, and 2 times 4 is 8. And so 3 has this ability in pairs to generate a set, a sequence of 8. And that those 8 then have a possibility in their pairedness to make a larger set of 8 times 8, or 64. So just as the I Ching, at the basis of Chinese civilization, had triadic trigrams, they had trigrams in pairs to make the hexagrams, and the hexagrams make a set of 64, so too does the life code everywhere in the universe have this similarity, have this structure. What is extremely important is that the structure came to be understood very quickly after the decipherment of the structure of the double helix of DNA, 1952. Watson's book on the double helix coming out in 1958. But the big development was in 1961 of finding that there is a single strand, not of DNA, not of the double helix, but a single strand of RNA called messenger RNA originally, and it is the messenger RNA that delivers the encodement from the double helix to the ribosomes that take this instruction and form a basis of traction upon which the proteins then are built. And the building happens always with a triplet codon that has a very specific structure, not only scientifically, but esoterically as well. There will always be an atom in the codon that is chemically a base. There will always be an atom that is chemically a sugar, and there will always be an atom that is chemically a phosphorus. So that there is a mnemonic that I have developed for you to help you understand and remember very easily what the triad, the working triad of the pen that writes the codes of life, and that this triad, the base, the sugar, the phosphorus, can be expressed as standing sweetly bright. The phosphorus turns on the light of the process. The sugar makes it sweet in that it really is life, organic and nourishing. And the base is a firmness upon which it can build and attach itself to other tractions like the ribosome and keep the sequence, and that this process was found by 1974. It took about 15 years after the discovery of how RNA is really the messenger trigger for the whole thing, of how all that works. And it was discovered that this works about 500 times a minute with almost no errors whatsoever everywhere in the universe. There's an enormously uncanny accuracy of transcription. What became difficult from 1974 on was the realization that some 20 years before, 30 years before really in its beginning, one of the great geniuses of physics, a man named Erwin Schrödinger, famous for the conundrum in quantum mechanics of Schrödinger's cat, is the cat dead or alive, because the experiment shows that it can be both at the same time. He wrote a book called What is Life in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, and he posed a problem. He said, it is obvious by this time that we're dealing with a universe that is encoded in such a way that we could mathematically understand the information before we actually found the information and use the mathematical model then to predict what we're going to find, what we need to find, and to design experiments. What is Life has come out in many new editions. This is a recent Cambridge University Press paperback with a foreword by Roger Penrose, the teacher of Stephen Hawking, and we're going to take Hawking and Penrose in a couple of weeks and look at the monstrous carnival of the cosmos, because it turns out to be more magical and real than mechanical and codified. What is Life also comes out in exquisite editions. This is the Folio Society in London, because it has become one of the great classics, but the classic aspect of Schrödinger's What is Life led to an increasing impasse in genetics, in molecular biology, and one of the individuals who was concerned with it at the time, Francois Gros, one of the discoverers, along with Jacques Monod, and also another Frenchman, their discovery about the RNA messenger, Francois Jacob, came to a crunch in an esoteric little book that was written and published in France in 1970 called Chance and Necessity by Jacques Monod. And in that book, it became apparent, as Francois Gros relates, 20 years ago or so, he's writing this in 1989, biologists had reason to feel satisfaction. The formal precision in the life sciences had hitherto, which it had hitherto lacked. And I'll read from the book itself. Was beginning to emerge with the central dogma, and the dogma was stated at the time, and we talked about it 2 weeks ago, that there was a beginning, middle, and end sequence. DNA yields RNA yields protein. DNA makes RNA, makes protein. And this was the dogma around 1969, 1970, and it firmed itself up in such a way that it reached the imagination of the world, not vibrantly, but what we would call, and did call in the 1960s in San Francisco, we called it freeze-dried. It came to you not in a living form, but it came to you in a dry, desiccated, freeze-dried abstraction in the form of an ideological dogma that soon began like an invisible cloud of sediment to settle over the creative imagination of science, of art, of history, of every conceivable aspect of human life, with the arrogance that this was, after all, the true facts. Those of us who struggled with this at the time realized that we were outclassed completely on every level, and that there had to be not only a change in every level, but that the very nature of learning itself had to be transformed. And it's taken me 40 years to be able to deliver to you how that works and how that happens and how it can work and does happen. Let me finish here with the quote from Francois Gros, one of the really major figures in 20th century science. Biology initially was a science of inventory and classification. In the hands of 19th century comparative naturalists, later transformed with the geneticists into a statistical science, and then with the pre-war biochemists into a powerful analytic discipline, had become a science of codes and circuits, taking on a strange resemblance to microelectronics and information science. One of the big branches of funding in our time is bioinformatics, the mathematical application of molecular biological structure, and you can hardly even pronounce it. Mispronouncing it on purpose, because it turns out to be increasingly a gobbledygook. A language that was fed along lines of information coding that were not able to be precise, and so they were mulched together statistically into probabilities. And so you got these tremendously powerful instructions of probability information, and one had to confirm and conform to these models. An example, in 1969, the shibboleth, to use an old Hebrew term, shibboleth means a belief which is destructive to you, that you continue to believe in anyway. One of the shibboleths in education was that all education had to be reduced down to the systems model. The author of that particular strategy was one of the founders of TRW, Simon Ramo. He's the R in TRW. Still alive here in Beverly Hills. He's a very old man, still alive. It was the systems approach to learning, that if you want to offer a course, you have to grind it down to modules and submodules and submodules until you are literally writing a computer program for the student who must follow that computer program exactly or they will fail. It freeze-dries all the juice out of learning. And of course, students, being human beings, did not fit very well with this mechanical, freeze-dried systems approach model. And ever since then, the percentage of people who finish school has diminished until it is a toss-up whether a student is going to graduate from high school or not. 50% of American high school students do not graduate. In order to graduate, one graduates to go on to an even more intense university level where everything is ground even finer. There are not only systems and subsystems and modules, but now there are sub-modular, almost like subatomic levels where everything is prescribed and proscribed down to not just the letter, but to all the possibilities that you might try to imagine, and they have been cut off and curtailed beforehand so that there is no way for you to not go into what used to be called and should be called still an arcade game. Not only has education been put into that, but science has been put into that as well. Art has been put into that. Social forms have been put into that. Why do you think that the whole planet is revulsed by the modern condition? Because they are being poisoned by something that is not alive. It is a freeze-dried arcade game. And the penalty is very simple. Not that you will be died, but you will be banished. You will not get to participate. You will not have not only nice jobs, you will have no job. And you will not only have the job that you have been trained for, you will only have that part of the job that you were partially trained for. And so we are in a condition where, as to finish up with Francois Gros, biologists and physicists were now able to understand one another, to subscribe to similar objectives and share the same enthusiasm for a universe which was apparently beginning to yield up its secrets. And yet, this period, marked by the appearance of Jacques Monod's book, Chance and Necessity, 1970, was to go down in history as the end of a reign rather than as a triumphal stage in the progress of a science on the march. Was this because of the scientific fatalism professed by Monod himself in his well-known book, in which he calls on his contemporaries to celebrate with him the virtues of an austere ethics of knowledge? Remember the sentence, science disregards values. The concept of the universe it imposes today is devoid of all ethics. Or was it that the discipline was out of breath, or its protagonist needed to pause for a moment to reflect better on what had been achieved? The fact remains that biology and biologists had, with their remarkable molecular advances, somewhat cut themselves off from the world. And their ignorance of the social and economic realities on which biology was to have a profound impact cannot fail to strike the observer. Instead of learning from a drastic mistake, which repeated the same quality of mistakes again and again in human history, the application was to enforce the application of this and to dice up everyone and anyone permanently, and to prepare not just for the inculcation in schooling, but to prepare previous to the schooling, the inculcation of the very young, and finally, not only of the very young, but the pre-born embryos themselves. And so we live in a brave new world where the possibility is to enforce an arcade game phoniness permanently in such a way that no one will be able to know the difference whatsoever. Part of the delight of conscious learning is to recognize that little phrase and how potent it is that I gave to you as a mnemonic just to begin today. That the codons of the DNA are triplets: an atom which is a base chemically, an atom which is a sugar, an atom which is a phosphorus. And the mnemonic is standing sweetly bright. And it turns out that that standing sweetly bright, that triplet, that codon, is like the ancient thrice greatest Hermes. It's an old Hermetic wisdom. And not only that, but it has the first three of the 5 phases of the way in which all organic life reproduces. And the way that organic life reproduces, it has a 5-phase energy cycle, just like the Taoist 5-phase energy cycle of thousands of years ago. The first 3 phases in the Chinese energy cycle were Tao, Te, and Zhen. The first 3 phases in the life energy cycle are phases. The first one is called a prophase. The second one is called a pro-metaphase. And the third is called a metaphase. And those 3 phases together, one can mnemonically just call them pro-meta, meta. And the last 2 phases are easy to remember because you can just use the little 2-word phrase, and telling. Because the 4th phase is the ana phase, and the 5th phase is the telo phase, and tell. Pro-meta, meta, and tell. And those 5 phases are the way in which cells reproduce themselves in all organic forms of mitosis. What comes out from the 5th phase is called cytokinesis, where the new pair of cells have been successfully made out of the original cell. And the way that this happens is that the chromosome has the ability, in its kind of little X shape with one side longer than the other, to come apart, and the 2 parts of the pair of the chromosome are able to match with another pair from the other parent, so that each parent gives a chromosome that is able to split, and those chromosomes come together in a new pair of pairs, 1 strand from each parent for each of the new chromosomes. And when that happens, when the pair of pairs is squared, you have a universal quality of structure known as a frame of reference. And in that frame of reference, what is important is that, like the carpenter's square of Fuxi, once you know how the pair as the carpenter's square of making the angle and the side lengths, one can then pair those together, and those carpenter squares will make that square, will make that frame of reference. So the square is, in ancient wisdom, not counted 1, 2, 3, 4, but counted 2 squared 4. It's always a pair of pairs. A square is not 4 sides, it's a pair of pairs. Given the 2 angles and the 2 sides in their equanimity, so that when the 2 chromosomes that are now been made into two new chromosomes in the cell. Because there is a square, there's also a center. And because the center now has its fullness, there's a quality in nature that when something is full completely to the brim, just as it would overflow, it overflows then into the next stage, into the next phase. It doesn't overflow and then is lost. It overflows into the next stage. So once you have a square, you have a center, you have a point. And that point now, because it is not just a static square, it is a square that has a dynamis built in that complements its energy, structure, and form. And so the center, instead of staying statically put as a point, now begins to spin. And it acts not just as a center point, but it acts as a spindle, as they say in molecular biology. Or the better term I've always used is that it acts as a pivot. So that the point is now not just the point where it is on a plane, on a square plane, but there are many layers, many planes, and so the center points are all center points, but they're on a three-dimensional structure of many layers, and so now the points align in their pivotal rotational dynamic, and instead of having a single point, one now has a spindle. And every cell, when it reproduces, that spindle comes in the metaphase. And as soon as the metaphase is there, and the spindle now displaces the center, the nucleus of the cell temporarily disappears. And what you get is this pivotal dynamic spinning, which generates now a kind of a magnetic sphere, or an organic magnetic sphere in the cell. And the chromosomes, which in the pro-meta phase had been balanced at the equator of the sphere generated by the spindle and its dynamic spinning, they now migrate to the magnetic poles. They go from the equatorial part of that sphere to the poles, and when they go to the poles, it is able now to go through in the anaphase of being able to begin to separate. And the separation allows for the cell now to become two cells that have the same identical DNA, the same identical RNA, the same identical instructions for protein forming. And what is further, they have the fertility to pass that on to other cells that then will come out of those cells so that life is able to proliferate. And as it does, the quality of the information does not just clone itself, but it works in a complementarity where the differentiation now begins to occur equally with the integral. Because the differential is a direct functioning aspect of reality when it has as much rotational energy as it does stability in structure. When it has as much radiant energy as it does in the ability to cinch polarities into centeredness. So now you have two modes that are operating together. One is integral, to come together to make a form that's stable. The other is to differentiate that form so that it can open up into new possibilities, new aspects of a living organism, new living organisms. And so one has the differential and the integral together, just as our learning has. But the learning, if it is left, if education is left in a subject-oriented instruction that more and more has come to resemble dogmatic freeze-dried arcade game instructions, it does not do this. It only lays dead where someone left it, and it doesn't move from there at all. Truly dead ends. But because it's done on every level of learning possibility is killed. So that the nightmare that one has is not just that you have died, every aspect of your reality has been dead-ended. And you end up not with a Superman, and not even with an ordinary woman or man, but you end up with a Frankenstein, whose aberration, because of their now nature, prefers death to life. It's called Zombieville. And the world is very close to being a lunatic asylum for zombies. They're at home in a death-dealing world of dead ends. They prefer it. One of the great developments of the 20th century is not only the arts and sciences, but the vision of science fiction. And one of the most poignant beginnings was the science fiction novels of H.G. Wells. And we've talked about him several times before. This is the first edition of The Island of Dr. Moreau. The man, Dr. Moreau, London, 1896. First edition with the little illustrations in it. Dr. Moreau goes to an island to turn beasts into men by speeding up evolution. Here's a page or so of the 1896 original edition. At last that song ended. I saw the ape-man's face shining with perspiration, and my eyes, now being accustomed to the darkness, I saw more distinctly the figure in the corner from which the voice came. It was the size of a man, but it seemed covered with a dull gray hair, almost like a Skye Terrier. What was it? What were they all? Imagine yourself being surrounded by all the most horrible cripples and maniacs it is possible to conceive. And you may understand a little of my feelings with these grotesque caricatures of humanity about me. He is a five-man like me, said the ape-man. I held out my hands. The gray creature in the corner leant forward, not to run on all fours. That is the law. Are we not men? He said. He put out a strangely distorted talon and gripped my fingers. The thing was almost like the hoof of a deer protruded into claws. I could have yelled with surprise and pain. His face came forward and peered at my nails and came forward into the light of the opening of the hut, and I saw with a quivering disgust that it was like the face neither of man or beast, but the mere shock of gray hair with three shadowy overarchings to mark the eyes and mouth. He has little nails, said this grisly creature in his hairy beard. It is well. Let's take a break. Let's come back. We're at Science 7. Which means specifically that we're not studying science as a subject. We're learning by having science as a phase come as a culmination of 7 previous phases. The wisdom of the phase form of learning is that it brings forward into our own time in the most massive but kindly, comprehensive way. Ancient wisdom, East and West. Our phases always occur in pairs, which is part of the way in which nature actually does work. And as we build in the first year the integral frame of reference, the square, we don't build it in a sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, but we build it with allowing for a form to emerge out of a dynamic. And the first form in the universe that emerges is existence. Any particle that exists, any wave that exists, occurs because of a context which is dynamic, within which it has its discrete exactness. Otherwise, a form is not able to be emerged distinct from its context, from its background. And this happens twice. And it happens twice in such a way that both of the dynamic phases are able to be modulated so that they flow, as it were, in parallel. And each of the two forms have an ability to be aligned. And the very simple thing is that the mind, as a form, is able to be aligned to the body as a form. And when you do, there is a distinct kinesthetic quality of certainty called thusness, and a distinct centering of the mind called realization. And when the body and the mind are aligned, part of the alignment is that the double context of nature and culture have flowed in such a way that their flow has a synergy to it. So that the alignment of body and mind is in a synergy where nature and culture flow together. And when they do, it's the same thing as getting into the pro-meta phase of the way in which cells divide. And the very next movement, the very next phase in that, the meta phase, is where the center becomes pivotal and not just a center, but becomes the axis that generates the entire sphere now, which not only has polarity, stability in terms of electricity, of electromagnetism, of chemistry, of physics, of biology, but now has an added quality where it has a magnetic sphere and is able to have resonance. And on this level of resonance, one now speaks not of existence as a stability which can be aligned to a mind that is centered in certainty, but now one needs to have an expanded vocabulary, and we talk about organic, molecular structure has a vibratory actuality to it. So there is such a thing as the determination of molecular structure, and part of the determination is always molecular vibrations. And not only vibratory, but there are such universal phenomenon as vibronic coupling. Vibronic coupling, the interaction between the electronic and nuclear motions. So that there is then such a discipline as principles of nuclear magnetism, or magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or nuclear statistical spectroscopy, or a whole series of essays to a great scientist on the theme of resonances. So that when we come to life structures, it is that the existential actuality of the universe now has a vibratory, resonant dimension that has naturally emerged further out of the original physical, chemical, geological stability, which obviously was not dead, but was, Teilhard de Chardin once used the term pre-life. He said rocks are not dead, they're pre-life. And that they slip into the organic all the time, everywhere, in a natural way. And when they do, the dimension of life lives in such a way that it weaves its dimension of actuality back into the universe, and the universe now is alive. It's living. And because it's living, it has the dimensions of something which is, he used the overall visionary form of a flower. That the universe now has the capacity to bud out of itself and reach a flowering. And that this flowering, this opening up, the ancient Buddhist metaphors of the lotus, coming up through the mud, coming up through the muddy water, and coming into the sunlight, and the bud opening and flowering. In the West, very largely, it was the rose that was able to come up through the thorns and the rose bush into the bud and open, exfoliate. The flower has always been not just a symbol, but a way of taking the symbol and taking the realization of the symbol and letting it differentially open. And to disclose in its openness that the universe now has possibilities of livingness, which life now, when it comes back into nature, nature accepts completely, totally. So that life becomes not just natural, but it becomes a dimension further in complexity of the natural, now become, we use the term all the time, supernatural. And it's not that supernatural is irrational. It's not that it's occult. It is not that it is esoteric in its actuality. It is only esoteric seemingly because of a world that bases itself on dead ends that have been inculcated by inferior instruction and by quashing ideologies and by dogmas that truncate. Anyone who wakes up through that, or escapes from that, or matures out of that, comes into a rather universal family, a community of recognition that spans tens of thousands of years. It is evident that this is the quality. 20,000 years ago at Lascaux, the only human figure in the Lascaux complex is a man who has faced the unknown, the death that has threatened him from the unknown, and has survived and now has the head of a bird. And he carries a staff which has a bird's head on the staff. So that he has the scepter of being able to fly in a world where he originally was just a ground animal. He is now freed to live in the air as well, into the larger sphere. The air being the background and context to the earth itself. And we live at a time where not only the air, but the extension into outer space. It used to be called outer space in the 1950s, and then when we were able to go into outer space, it was then called just space, and sometimes space-time, and now we're in a generation of the early 21st century where we understand that space-time itself is a form, and that it has peculiar, very large properties, just like any kind of a form, and that it occurs within a context that we can only describe as reality or superspace. That around such objects as a black hole, one can notice that the very frame of time-space drags. It's like an old film being run on an old projector. And if the gate is not clean, the film used to shimmy in the gate, and you would get a dancing image on the screen. We now know that time, that space-time itself is a form that has the possibilities of having its frame dragged from intense gravitational pulls of black hole structures. So that we face a threshold of an incredible maturity that has gone not only the ability to fly in air and to fly in space, but to fly into a further reality, which is infinite indeed. One of the qualities that this further differentiated, expanded vision has is that there is an intermediate vision which delivers a form, and the form has the classic name of art. And that it is not only that paintings are art, or sculpture is art, or architecture is art, but it turns out that the maturing of the human person is an art. That the educating of a person in their maturing is an art. There is an art of teaching which is superior to education, just as education is superior to mere instruction. Just as mere instruction is superior to mechanical programming. But in order to get to these larger expansions, we need to acclimate ourselves to the realization that's carried into a further dimension called consciousness. And that five-dimensional conscious space-time will deliver the forms of art. But that those forms will not be like existential forms or mental forms, they will be differential forms. That is, they will be like lenses, like prisms, like jewels. So that the ancient wisdom saying that the spiritual person is a radiant jewel is absolutely true. It's actually the case. But they have not only the radiant quality, but there's also this rotational dynamic that is there as well. And when consciousness is raised to a higher resonance, a higher set into true harmonics, the rotation of the dynamic shows itself in what is called chirality, a symmetry of going clockwise or going counterclockwise at the same time. One can go either way. And so historical consciousness has a peculiar differential dimension to it, and that is chirality, which, if it is held in a differential symmetry, it makes not only a symmetry of nature, but it makes a supersymmetry of high conscious nature. And we'll see when we get to Stephen Hawking's and Roger Penrose that their great combined presentation together on the nature of the universe is moving us very, very close to the very threshold that we have been at now for the last decade or so, and is just beginning to occur to people that something real is happening here. It is not a realization. It is several orders beyond realization. It is beyond in the sense that it is conscious, a conscious vision, but a conscious vision that has produced a personal prism that is able to diffract the differentiality even further and to refine it. And what comes out of that are not just works of art, but the forms of science. Not science as a subject, but science as a phase, a differential phase, carrying in a harmonic the ability of art to be appreciated and refined by critique. It is the critical refinement that makes the art better and better. And that matures itself harmonically in an analytic of science. And science's ability to be analytic is not to reduce it down, but to refine it out in its expansiveness and in its chirality and its symmetry. The difficulty of doing this is that if the mind is closed off, if it is deadened by false teaching, by false instruction, it resents anything that tries to go beyond its corralling, and one increasingly then has a devolution. We're taking along with the great molecular biologist Barbara Mcclintock. Her papers are at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. It was founded by Benjamin Franklin about 250 years ago. Still there, still working. In addition to Barbara Mcclintock, we're taking a science fiction writer, Nancy Kress. We're taking her science fiction novel, Beggars in Spain. And we talked last week about her concern, all of her life, all of her writing life. She had first been a fourth grade teacher for a number of years, then she went into advertising and was with an advertising firm writing copyright for 5 years, and then she discovered that her ability to envision allowed her to write some of the most sophisticated science fiction of the current era. And so here's another example of her work, Maximum Light, written in 1998. It takes place in the middle of the 21st century, when the fertility rate has dropped 80% around the planet, that 80% of men and women are infertile. And part of the difficulty then is that the median age of people on the planet is in the late 50s. And children are very rare and hard to come by, and they're getting more rare, more difficult to come by. And one of the figures in here is a young man who has been subjected to a kind of a partial lobotomy of his memory. And he can't remember what it was that they took out of him. But it turns out in the story that he is the prime exemplar of what has gone wrong, and only if one could recover what he is unable to remember is there a possibility of turning this around. Another one of her works is, because she's always concerned with aliens, it's called An Alien Light. The British edition had a different cover on it. The British edition liked to have these mysterious new worlds that are alien, but for the American edition, it was that It isn't an alien world, it is our world in its alienness. This is distinct from early 20th century because in the early 20th century, the response to the inanity of the world was alienation, a term taken over by from Karl Marx at one time, that man is alienated. It isn't that man is alienated. It is that the culture has not flowed with nature, has dominated it in a stranglehold because it has a superior power now of technology to be able to constrain nature to the extent that nature no longer can flow, nor can the culture flow with nature. It has to be contorted to fit with the ideation of the mentality that is superenforced by the technological force and application. The simple example: if you want to build a subdivision of 8,000 homes that are exactly the same on a piece of land, you first bulldoze any hills in the land, you fill any kind of creeks and put them into drain pipes, and then you can build 8,000 exactly the same homes on exactly the same kind of configurations, and you get human communities, suburbs, that look more and more like microchips. Now, you will be okay as long as you stay in the circuit of that neighborhood microchip. Otherwise, we are going to have to perform an excision, because you will be an impurity in the form, and you will be an obstruction in the process. So now it is not man who is alienated, but it is an alien light of the entire world. The world has become alien to us. So that we now have a very peculiar quality. Science fiction has this ability in the 100 years between H.G. Wells of the 1890s and Nancy Kress of the 1990s and on into the beginning of the 21st century, the realization that what has happened here has had stages of its devolvement, and that one of the severest devolving stages happened in the early 1980s. Right at the time that we read a little bit from Francois Gros' The Gene Civilization about Jacques Monod's Chance and Necessity, 1970, saying that everything is got to be freeze-dried. Everything has to be put into its place abstractly, mechanically, on the basis of models that have nothing to do with ethics or life or concerns other than the efficiency of the movement and the accuracy of reproducing the form. And the ideal is not a matured person, but a clone of a successful cog. And of course, the first time that this rose in a massive realization was in the 1960s. And one of the great phrases at the time, I heard it personally on the steps of Sproul Hall at Berkeley. A young graduate student named Mario Savio, impassioned in shirt open and sleeves, and said, "We obviously have been put into the very thing that Charlie Chaplin was in The Great Dictator, that he is tending a huge machine, and we have become caught in the gears of this huge machine. And what we need to do is to throw enough of us on those gears to stop them from going on, because they are grinding us up. And they're getting better and better at being able to do this." That was 40 years ago. One of the things that surfaces is that the quality of science fiction changes as one goes in that century. Very early on, I read to you a little bit of the original 1896, The Island of Dr. Moreau. Just to refresh you, a few more, just paragraph or so. The man for the first time is seeing these beasts who are no longer beasts, but they're not quite men, and there are all kinds of scary, horrifying figures around him, and one of them has pulled him into the light because his claw talons, made out of deer's hooves, are very long, and this man has short little nails. He has little nails, said this grisly creature, in his hairy beard. It is well. He threw my hand down, and instinctively I gripped my stick. Eat roots and herbs, it is his will, said the ape man. I am the sayer of the law, said the gray figure. Here come all that be new, to learn the law. I sit in the darkness and say the law. It is even so, said one of the beasts in the doorway. Evil are the punishments of those who break the law. None escape. None escape, said the beast folks, glancing furtively at each other, because it turns out that if they have the slightest infraction of the law that's been inculcated, they're taken back to the house of pain, where they are re-operated on to get rid of this bestial, wild tendency to not toe the lines of the law. One of the scariest movies ever made. It's called The Island of Lost Souls, based on The Island of Dr. Moreau, made in the 1930s, starring young Charles Lawton, and of course Lila Hyams as the Panther Woman. It is a very, very scary movie to see. Not a horror flick where it's nice to be scared this way, but by the 21st century, we are understanding that it's not so much of being raised from beasts to men, but it's that the original nature of human beings is being processed, pasteurized, homogenized, codified in such a way that it is increasingly unlikely that anyone will know anything different from what is programmed. This is from August 1950. This is Famous Fantastic Mysteries. H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, written just a year before The Island of Dr. Moreau, of the man from 1896 London who goes forward in time to where humanity has been divided into two groups. The Eloi, who are nice and childish, who just play all the time on the surface, and the Morlocks who live under the surface, who tend the machinery that keep everything going, and they raise the Eloi as their food supply. Part of the catastrophic difference was at the end of the Second World War, when H.G. Wells wrote Mind at the End of Its Tether, one of his last books, saying that he has lived long enough to understand that we have come to a complete impasse with the atomic bomb. And by the early 1980s, you notice a science fiction trend which is uncanny, and two examples of them, Blade Runner and The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. One came out in 1982, the other 1984. And they're part of our learning, part of our education. They're worth reviewing to see. This is based on Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream in Their Sleep? And this one, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, Across the Eighth Dimension. They're worth seeing. And one can understand that what has happened here is that there was a phase threshold at the end of the 1970s that's apparent not only in the science, but in the science fiction of the time, and by the early 1980s had mustered itself into a further devolution. A devolution where the powers of ideological impressing upon culture to make sure that it is squeezed out and will only be what it is commanded to be and will no longer have any kind of a cue from nature. Because nature itself now is able to be atomically, molecularly, electronically, magnetically manipulated. Why should culture try to be flowing with nature when nature can be contorted just as well as culture? So it will be what it wants to be. And one of the most famous mantras of this occurs at a poignant moment in Moby Dick by Herman Melville, where the first mate Starbuck says to Captain Ahab, "You have become unnatural, and nature will punish us if we go along your way." And Ahab's reply is, "Man, I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." We have a peculiar quality which our learning addresses not in specifics, not in subjects, not in conflicts or in challenges, but to rephase the entire maturation from the wildness of nature all the way through into the arts of the person and the sciences of the cosmos. We're getting very close to the refinement of that. I brought 2 reference volumes to let you see how far things have gone. This is a 2005 science catalog, and it lists thousands and thousands of pages of technological apparatus by which you can manipulate atomic and molecular and electronic structure to almost any degree of specification. This is about 4 years old now. This is the Nature yearbook. Nature is the international science magazine. This is just a listing of all the science-focused places on the planet. Just a bare listing of them with a couple of sentences or a paragraph. It is not that there is one place or 1,000 places. There are 100,000 places. All equipped, all refining, all laboring under layers and layers of arcade game instruction that is eventually death-dealing. The stresses of our world are not stresses of people not getting along. They are stresses of an alien enculturation that has made an enemy of everything alive. What we're doing is slowly maturing ourselves, not to be able to be scared at seeing this and not to feel impotent at confronting this, but at realizing that all of this is of a very peculiar nature. It is not a real situation. It can be evaporated like a bad dream. But as Dune, another science fiction movie from the early 1980s, the sleeper has to awaken. But to awake from this particular nightmare, one can't just wake up because one wakes up from the nightmare into a nightmarish world. And one can't just leave a nightmarish world because the very structures and dynamics that made it nightmarish are in us and are carried with us wherever we go. It will be just a further nightmare world without end. Space now, in the popular imagination, is inhabited by monsters of the most insidious kind everywhere. Why would anyone want to go out there? when you can stay in the safe microchip suburbs and play arcade games and get a paycheck, as long as you don't offend anyone, including yourself. Barbara Mcclintock is our scientist, and we're going to go deeper into her next week. Her incredible achievement was first surfaced in 1931 when she was 29 years old. And she wrote with one of her graduate students, Harriet Crichton, and it's reprinted in this commemorative volume, The Dynamic Genome, Barbara Mcclintock's Ideas in the Century of Genetics. By 1931, she was able to write a correlation of cytological and genetical crossing over in Zea maize. Zea maize is Indian corn. What she called crossing over was the first time that anyone had really put together a number of observations that had been made before then, but had not had any way to come into a resonant set, and many observations that over the next 30, 40 years would be made, but were not put into the resonant set because no one paid much attention to Barbara Mcclintock. Science is for men. She's a woman. She's not dealing with atomic physics. She's dealing with corn. And how is she dealing with corn? She's raising her corn in fields outside of a building in a university, and eventually she went to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on Long Island, and for 50 years tended her cornfields. But she tended them like an earth mother would tend children. She got to know each plant, each cob, each chromosome, each gene on each chromosome through generations and generations until she could recognize them on sight. And she saw that this gene with this function doesn't have to stay where it was by some abstract plan that made it certain that it must never leave there, and that it jumps. It jumps position. It transposes its place, and when it does so, it doesn't do it on its own recognizance like some delinquent, but that the entire group within which that gene jumps cooperates with the jumping and sends a gestalt resonance through the entire chromosome set so that all the groups are part and parcel of how this happens. Is a creative process. That life is an art as well. And that what it is about is not just to reproduce its existence, but to play with its possibilities. And the higher one goes in organisms, the more the play needs the freedom of actuality. Corn only has 10 chromosomes. We have more than twice as many. We have a readout genomically that dwarfs these kinds of books. But not only that, that's just the genome. There is a further differential resonance of the genome called the proteome. There are tens of thousands of proteins. Very few of them have been understood so far. So as the 21st century goes on, we will see more and more like the concentric blasts of creative explosion, the development into the freedom of the play, of the reality of life, rather than the old games that were foisted on us. The difficulty is that almost everyone has been trained to stay in their cages. it's going to be very difficult for them to realize that no one needs to hold those bars anymore, that you can walk out, and the problem is exacerbated. What will you walk out into? And one of the films from the late 1970s, Logan's Run, takes that as its theme. Two people raised in a domed city for generations, and when they first go outside, they're horrified. It smells odd. Something very hot is rising on the horizon. They've never felt it before. And there's no comfort. There are no troughs of food. You have to find food and all kinds of things. More next week.